Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the whistle. I think that might be for Ed. We're going to start with a fact which might make some of us in this room feel either surprised, nostalgic, or simply old. But Toy Story is about to turn 20 years old this month. To celebrate the occasion, we're going to show a short movie on the theme of friendship from Pixar. It may be the end of the Web Summit, but I promise you this will be one of the highlights you will remember. So Ed, how do you feel that Toy Story is now 20? Does it feel like it was 20 years ago?
Well, all this is inconceivable. I think probably the biggest surprise was, looking forward from 20 years ago, was I never imagined that it would continue to be just as hard 20 years later. Now I know better, and it's going to be just as hard in 20 years.
So, just a sort of silly question to get this off. If Pixar were making a story of your life, how would it go, and who would the enemies be? Who would be the evil monsters in it?
The evil monsters. Well, looking back, I always felt that the thing that got in the way was, people trying to repeat what took place in the past. I suppose one thing that I realized is that when I was a kid, I had a fear. My biggest fear was that as I grew older, I would turn into an old fart. And I didn't want that to happen, because it seemed like it was happening. And it wasn't until I got to Lucasfilm, when we were visited by two famous animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, and they'd written this book, The Illusion of Life. They were in their mid-70s, and they were full of life. And they said, we wish we were doing what you guys are doing now. We wish we were young again so we could do that. So these guys aren't old farts. And at the same time, I saw a young manager there at Lucasfilm who was pretty cranky and cantankerous and very conservative. And that's when I realized that old farts come from young farts. So, driving factor in my life.
So, obviously at Pixar, you seem to have a lot of adults who are basically educated Peter Pan type figures. You know, they have retained a sense of sort of their childhoods. In fact, there was a lovely story about John Lasseter, who's one of your co-founders, who is basically a big kid. And apparently when his child lost a tooth, he took a toy car and inked the wheels and ran it back and forth over the pillow to make it look like the tooth fairy had arrived and then driven away at speed. So I'd just be interested in some of your sort of discussing how you create a sense of childishness and wonder at Pixar, and how important that is to the creative process.
Well, one thing we do is to try to encourage and allow impish things to happen. We've always had this history of people doing things off the wall. And we want that. In fact, my worry is that people come in that regardless of what people say. They're taking cues from other people. So the people that used to play the practical jokes have got kids and they go home. They love the practical jokes, but they're not doing them as much anymore, and they would like the young ones to do it. The young people are coming and saying, well, they're not doing it, I better not do it because I'm stepping out of line. But we can't impose top-down practical jokes. So we have to make sure we always allow it. So as an example, this is a year, I guess 2 years ago, we had a concert. We have 17 bands at Pixar. And so the concert went up to 10 o'clock, and that's the limit when you have to stop. So right at 10 o'clock on the last band, the police came in and shut us down. And what I learned later was that some people thought they were in trouble because that happened. So I went and say, no, the fact that we got shut down by the police is really cool. And they were so relieved to hear that. But I realized that we always have to make sure people understand that doing those things which are on the edge are part of what we want to have happen.
So how do you manage that? Because obviously as a leader, and you've written a lot about creativity in your book, and you described in your book that my job is to look at the dynamics of a room and measure the team not by output, but by spirit, and whether the team members are laughing. Is that actually true? I mean, and how do you sort of manage that between being actually, you want to get stuff done too?
Well, first of all, the people are so intense about getting things done that this is not our problem. They're professionals, they want to get the film done, they want to have an impact with it. So if you understand that's their intent, then our problem isn't getting them to work hard. The problem is actually to get them to lighten up and let mistakes happen. So we're a culture that talks about mistakes and failures and letting things happen, and they all agree with that, and yet when it gets down to doing the job, they don't want to go over budget, they don't want things to go out of control. So the natural thing that happens, I think, in every company is to be so driven to deliver that they actually end up inducing fear and worry in people. And looking at the psychology of the room is to say, well, this is happening, how do we pull back? How do we let the mistakes happen and have people feel okay about it?
And when do you know, when you look at a room, when things are going really wrong? Well, what do you look for?
Well, first of all, when they're going right, there's laughter in the room. And it isn't like you're going right from wrong. There's this gradual process in between. And with every film, we always have something that goes wrong. If we didn't, we'd be done when we started. I mean, it's an important concept, but it's harder for people to get. So when we start our films, they all suck. Right? They don't work. And I don't mean this in the sense that I'm being self-effacing or modest. I mean it in the sense that they suck. And it's an important concept. You don't have things right to begin with. And if you're doing something new, you can't get it right. So we're going through an iterative process. And the implication is, while we're going through the iterative process, you cannot judge people by whether or not the thing they're working on is good. Because if you did, you would shut them all down. So you have to measure them by the spirit in the room, believing that they will fix the problems. And then if they can't do it, then over time people will raise flags, and our responsibility behind closed doors is to teach them, coach them, add people. Usually that works. Sometimes it doesn't. It spills over and it becomes very obvious that it's not working. So you have to respond by the need at the time. And here's the trick, though. It's very important not to over-respond. That is, sometimes we can tell if a leader is not going to work out. We took a risk because they're good, and their intent is good, but sometimes they don't make the transition, and I can usually tell fairly early. But we don't pull the plug at that time. And the reason we don't pull the plug, even though we're certain they're not going to work out, is if we moved at the time that it was clear it wasn't going to work, we would induce fear in the other leaders. Because they would then think as soon as something failed, the plug gets pulled. So we actually have to wait longer in order to keep from inducing fear in other parts of the organization.
But you've had some very dramatic redos of movies. You've pulled some movies recently in terms of the scheduling of them. Talk me through how you manage that process, the right balance between creating fear and actually allowing a creative process to go forward. Because you've also talked a lot about how you would try to protect the new. Because if you're not trying something new, you're not doing anything different.
Yes, so you go through this phase where you're protecting them while they're wandering around. And then usually that results in something which is pretty remarkable, because it's the wandering around that lets them discover stuff. But if they can't get out of it, if they're stuck or they're lost, then we need mechanisms to help them out of it. But if they can't get out of it, then we'll make major changes, or we'll reset a film and restart. Now, it's unfortunate because while it's very painful, and it's painful to the people that are involved with this, and for some of them it's embarrassing to go through with this. The fact is, their wandering informed the people that follow them. They were part of making something successful, even though they couldn't get it over the finish line. So the whole notion of restarting, unfortunately, has this difficulty with it, but it really is the whole. It's that whole process of going through the failures which end up making something as good as it is.
You've talked a lot in your book about failure, and particularly Disney. Lots of different experiences of Disney, but one of the things you noted with Disney in its past was it started to fail historically when it stopped adopting new technology. And a lot of the energy wasn't in the animation and just the stories, it was in the technology and the integration of that. Can you talk about how you managed also the embrace of technology now in terms of obviously Disney and Pixar faces lots of new ways of presenting information, mobile, YouTube, different ways of engaging audiences. How do you manage that kind of technological change?
Well, one thing which is it's a misconception about what took place in the early days of Disney. At that time, filmmaking was the new technology. Now, we look back at it and think it's old technology, but it wasn't then. And Walt Disney adopted all the new technology as it came along, and it kept infusing this energy into the organization. When he died, that stopped. And people look at the output and say, oh, well, it's purely an art form, without realizing that he was combining the artists with the technical innovation. And then in the late 80s, Roy Disney Jr. was part of a takeover, and when he came in, he's the one that insisted on the contract with Pixar. So this is our first thing with him. It wasn't to make a movie, it was to write software for painting cells. And Roy understood that infusing technology gave energy to the art. Now, having watched that mistake be made, then our belief was that we have to fully understand and embrace the fact that the technology with the art, as peers with the artists, have sort of a yin-yang with each other. That is, the technology is inspiring the artists, and the artists are challenging the technology. But it isn't that we arrive somewhere, it's that we continually circle each other, trying to advance it forward. And we're trying to set up so that doesn't stop, that we don't fall over the cliff that they went over in the past, because we're explicit about it. They weren't then, and they weren't in the 90s at Disney. So now it's to say, oh guys, that was a mistake that was made in perception about how you solve problems.
Talk a bit about your experience with Disney. Obviously, Disney was failing for a long time, and you're now responsible for Disney animation, and lo and behold, Disney has been improved. And I think you recently declared that they turned around and said, you'd achieved your ends. How does that feel to have gone in with some of your management ideas and improved Disney? And how has that affected as well your relationship with Pixar as a manager?
Well, it was 10 years ago, essentially, that we were closing the deal with Disney. So I've been commuting back and forth for 10 years. And the group, when we got there, had basically failed, and they knew they'd failed. So they welcomed us in because they wanted a chance to succeed. But at that time, I didn't know anybody down there. What we did, though, was we assumed that they had good intentions, but we didn't know if they were good, or we didn't know if they had just been trained badly. So assuming they were good, we then started the process of talking about how brain trust works. With the technical groups, we had to get them off this notion that there's a right way of doing things. They're very process-oriented. And we had to have them think about failure and mistakes in a very different way. It took 2 years for the brain trust to actually get to a high level. It took 4 years for the entire organization to actually turn around. But they did, and they produced Tangled and Wreck-It Ralph and Frozen and Big Hero 6. So it's a completely different place. Now, when we started, most of the people thought we should close them down. And there was a logic to it. That is, if we tried to revive them, we would spread ourselves too thin and we put Pixar at risk. And we treated them, and we kept them completely separate. So they were not allowed to do any production work for each other. In the end now, they're very successful. But here's the interesting thing to me, and that is, actually two interesting things. One is, we could describe the principles we want to operate under in 4 hours. They all nodded their head in agreement, because it's very easy to state and agree to your values. It took 4 years for them to actually get it deeply, which is a common thing that goes on. But the other one, and I think this is the most important point, is that they were considered to be a big failure at the time we took over. Now they're a big creative success, and they're largely the same people. All we did was to remove the barriers and the blocks and the things that got in the way of creativity.
So has there been any knock-on effect in terms of the experience at Pixar that some of your senior people have had to spend so much time at Disney and not at Pixar?
I didn't quite hear the first part of the question because of the echo.
Just in terms of the implications of how much time you've had to spend at Disney.
Well, at first, I think, though some people expressed it was like, you know, mom and dad took on another family, and so all of a sudden they're worried about the other kids and not us. And there was a little at the beginning with, but in fact, because we made sure they were separate cultures and we had some people that we were raising up in both organizations, that in the end it was just realized, oh, we're a different place. We've got our own culture, our own way of thinking about it. And so both have done remarkable things. There's been no degradation in what we've done because of the fact that there are two studios. And they get along very well. And this is one of the unintended effects, which is a technological one and a creative one. From a technical point of view, we said to each company, you can beg, borrow, and steal technical ideas from the other, but you don't have to. There was no existential threat. We weren't saying you have to use best practices. So the result is those groups loved to share with each other because they knew one of the consequences would not be that they had to work some other way. The advantage, though, is that in this world of rapid change, the fact that we've got two groups with different personalities working on similar problems makes us stronger. Now, the same thing happened creatively. We've got a brain trust at both groups, and they're making separate films, but once per film, when we're late in the game and we've got some crisis and we can't figure out what's wrong, we'll show the film to the other studio. And because they speak the same language, they like each other, and they know how to give good notes, then they're fresh eyes and they help us solve problems. Now, we never set out to do that, but once we got that, it was like this incredible asset.
So most of your films have made an average of $250 million each. So what's the toughest thing about running a movie company like that?
Well, we clearly want our films to have success in the world. We also want our films to do financially very well. And one of the reasons for that is we want to be able to take risks. It's actually when you don't make money that somebody comes in from the outside and says, you don't know what you're doing, so we're going to tell you how to make it better. We are fortunate the films do well, and Disney has never asked us to do anything in terms of the films that we make. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. They give us a free hand. They also live with our failures. So we have a lot of failures. The failures are very expensive. they've never been questioned because they understand that it's part of our process. So yeah, we're happy the films do well. It's more important to people at the company that people like the film than it is they do well. I mean, that's their feeling. I want both.
But that's easy to say when you make $250 million a film.
It's very easy to say when you make $250 million a film.
So what's we're about to run out of time, but what's the thing on your bookshelf a visitor would be surprised to find?
Well, I got a number of toys on my bookshelf. I just have an eclectic set of books. I mean, I don't have much in the way of computer science anymore because the last several years, while I keep up, I find the most interesting things are the sociology and the psychology of how people work together. And for me, it's just completely fascinating.
And which book other than your own would you recommend that the audience should be rushing out to buy?
Well, there certainly isn't a single one. I'm reading a book now about transitions at different times in the life where we tend to think of like an event that may change our life, but actually it's after an event that we have to go through a process of integrating it or fighting it. And how do you think about things so you integrate what you've learned? Another book was Mindset, which is, again, it has to do with the way you look at the world, how you perceive things. And most of us, while we intellectually we know that we filter the world, I think from a deep point of view, most people don't realize how much they filter the world. And if you understand it fairly deeply, then I think it opens you up to say, I actually want to know what that person thinks because they see the world very differently than I do. And if you look at those as additive views, then you end up in a much stronger place.
Well, I'm afraid I perceive that we're out of time. There is so much more we could be asking you today. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your movies. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
It's so fast.